Welcome to London's Dark Archives, where we explore the chilling mysteries of London's criminal past. Today, we're delving into the story of the last canonical five, Mary Jane Kelly, whose gruesome death remains one of the most disturbing murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. This episode will not focus on the violence inflicted upon her, but rather on her life, her relationships, the witnesses who saw her last, in the area where she lived and died. Spitalfields, an area rich with history that remains largely preserved to this day. We'll also dig into the conflicting witness statements that have caused so much debate, including the strange claim from a close acquaintance that she saw and spoke with Mary after the time of her supposed death. Was it a case of mistaken identity, or could something more sinister have been at play? Please note, this episode contains discussions of historical violence and distressing events that some viewers may find unsettling. Please be advised before continuing. Unlike the other Ripper victims, Mary Jane Kelly's background is something of a mystery. She was much younger, around 25, and was described as more attractive and lively than the older, more worn-down women that had previously fallen victim to the killer. Born in Ireland around 1863, Mary was said to have moved to London after living in Wales, though her stories about her past varied wildly depending on whom she was talking to. She sometimes claimed to have come from a wealthy family and even said she had once lived in Paris, but there's no solid evidence to confirm these tales. By the time of her death, Mary was living in a small, humble room at 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street, Spitalfields, a narrow, crime-ridden alley that epitomised the slum conditions of the East End. Her life, like many of the others in Whitechapel, had been shaped by poverty and hardship. But she was also known to be a lively, even charming presence in the local pubs, especially the 10 Bells. Spitalfields, where Mary lived and died, was a vibrant but deeply impoverished area in 1888. Just as it is today, it was a place filled with markets, bustling streets, and an ever-changing population of immigrants and working-class Londoners. The Spitalfields market, still a thriving part of London today, was already well established, and its lively stalls and surrounding streets were up of activity, drawing traders and residents from all over the city. Miller's Court, however, was far from the prosperity of the market. It was a cramped, narrow passage with dilapidated buildings lining the street, filled with residents living hand to mouth. The entrance to Miller's Court was through a dark, narrow archway off Dorset Street, which was often described as the most dangerous street in London. Many of the buildings in the area were Georgian-era tenements, housing dozens of families in squalid conditions. Today, though much of the area has been redeveloped, parts of Whitechapel and Spitalfields still retain their 19th century character. The streets of Fournier Street and the iconic Christ Church Spitalfields are much as they was during Mary's time, allowing visitors to get a real sense of the world she inhabited. The 10 Bells pub in particular remains a key landmark in Jack the Ripper lore. It was one of Mary's regular haunts, and the pub has been restored to its Victorian glory. Walking inside it today, it's easy to imagine what it was like in 1888. Dimly lit, smoke-filled, and filled with the chatter of locals, including those like Mary, who live life on the fringes. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th, 1888 stands out for many reasons. It was the only one of the Ripper murders to take place indoors, in her small rented room at 13 Miller's Court. The brutal nature of her death was compounded by the fact that the killer had the privacy and the time to carry out the attack, far from the watchful eyes of the street or passers-by. But what makes this case particularly intriguing are the conflicting witness statements and the confusion surrounding around the timeline of Mary's last hours. One of the most fascinating and debated pieces of testimony come from Caroline Maxwell, a woman who knew Mary Jane Kelly and claimed to have spoken to her after her supposed time of death. Maxwell stated under oath that she had seen Mary outside her room around 8:30 a.m. on the morning of November 9th, several hours after the murder was thought to have taken place. According to the coroner, Mary's death occurred between 3:30 and 5 a.m. based on the state of her body when it was discovered. Maxwell, however, was adamant she had seen Mary leaning against the wall, appearing sick and unwell, and she even exchanged a few words with her. Maxwell wasn't the only witness who added to the confusion. Another witness, Maurice Lewis, also claimed to have seen Mary alive that morning. This has led to years of speculation. Were both witnesses mistaken? Was this a case of mistaken identity? Or could someone else have been in Mary's room, a victim of mistaken identity in the chaos of a mutilated body, long before DNA or reliable forensic methods? Maxwell's testimony has remained a point of contention in this case. While many believe it was simply a mistake, others argue that the confusion and the conflicting statements suggest something more. Could Mary Jane Kelly have been seen by Maxwell in the morning, and was someone else killed in her place? The mutilation of the body was so severe that identification was near impossible, leading some to believe the victim could have been another woman altogether. The morning of November 9th was eerily quiet in Miller's Court. Mary's neighbours didn't report hearing any violent struggles, though some mentioned hearing a faint cry of murder in the early hours of the morning, a sound so common in Whitechapel it often went ignored. The scene was discovered when Mary's landlord, John McCarthy, sent his assistant Thomas Bowyer to collect rent from her. Bowyer knocked on the door but received no response, and when he peered through the broken window he saw the gruesome remains of Mary Jane Kelly's body. The room itself was a grim picture of poverty. A small bed, a makeshift fireplace, and little else. The single window had been broken and a coat had been used to stuff the gap, likely to keep out the cold. It was through this window that Bowyer would glimpse the horror inside. The scene of the crime, located just a stone's throw from bustling Spitalfields market, would have shocked even the most ardent residents of Whitechapel. Yet the streets around Miller's Court were known for their lawlessness and poverty, with Dorset Street often referred to as the worst street. Walking around this part of Spitalfields today, it's easy to imagine the narrow dark alleyways and the sense of isolation and danger that must have permeated the area at the time. Much of the architecture from that period remains intact, and visitors can still trace the steps of Mary Jane Kelly and other figures from the Ripper saga as they walk through the streets that witness so much despair. We've reached the point in this where I'll give you my opinion. Now, there are several reasons why I don't believe Mary Jane Kelly's murder was the work of Jack the Ripper. For one, it took place indoors, unlike the previous Ripper killings, which all occurred in public spaces where the killer could strike quickly and escape. Additionally, the level of mutilation in Mary's case was far more extreme, suggesting a different psychological profile or motive. I believe Mary's murder was a copycat crime, likely carried out by her boyfriend Joseph Barnett. The couple had recently separated after a tumultuous relationship, and Barnett had reportedly been jealous of Mary's continuing to see clients. Barnett knew Mary's life intimately and would have been familiar with the stories surrounding Jack the Ripper after hearing exaggerated accounts in the pubs and the streets. Acting out these stories, he may have murdered Mary in a jealous rage and then mutilated her body in an attempt to imitate what he thought Jack the Ripper would do. Also, the strange witness testimonies, particularly from Carolyn Maxwell, raised questions. Could someone else have been killed in Mary's place? The identification of the body was based on little more than the victim's hair colour, her eyes, and some personal belongings, making it possible that the woman in the room weren't Mary at all. While Mary Jane Kelly is considered the last of the Canonical Five, she wasn't the last victim of the Whitechapel murders. The mystery of Jack the Ripper endures, and though Mary's death is often seen as the final chapter, the East End would continue to be plagued by violence and crime. Mary Jane Kelly's story remains one of the most haunting in the Ripper cases, not just because of the brutality of the murder, but because of the many questions it raises. Was she truly Jack's last victim, or was her death the work of another closer to home? We may never know for certain, but her murder marks a tragic conclusion to one of history's darkest crime sprees. Mary Jane Kelly's life and death encapsulate the desperation and brutality of life in 19th century Whitechapel. As the last of the Canonical Five, her murder has come to symbolise the end of Jack the Ripper's reign of terror, though her story remains filled with mystery and unanswered questions. Spitalfields today retains much of its Victorian atmosphere, and for those who wish to step back in time, many of the streets, buildings and landmarks associated with Mary and the other victims can still be visited. If you ever find yourself walking down the streets of Whitechapel or Spitalfields, take a moment to pause, reflect, and remember the lives that were tragically cut short in the fog-shrouded alleyways of Victorian London. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue to unravel the mysteries of London's most infamous unsolved crimes. Please remember to like, share, comment, and if you haven't already, please subscribe.